Thank you so much for your enthusiasm for the topic. I've enjoyed the session tremendously. The empirical studies were fascinating. Michael, thank you for your talk, and I would love to know whether you were telling a true or humorous story about Harvard. If it's true, I would love to know your source, because I thought it was just a fascinating story. Now, Michael admitted to not having data, but at least he had a book. And what I want to tell you about is the book that I haven't written yet, but I plan on publishing in 2023. So this is kind of an advanced preview. I am optimistic that I will write it and I will publish it. But the point of telling you that is that I'm truly open for comments, critiques, arguments, telling me what I should have read and should have known. So by all means, send away. Before I get started, I also just wanted to thank Falk and all the organizers. This has been a fascinating conference. Perhaps as one of the older people attending the conference, it's just fascinating to see how the next generation is going to redefine the social sciences, and certainly the do-good aspect of this conference has an awful lot of appeal to me. Okay, so on with my agenda in this talk. I want to start by telling you a story about a fascinating younger woman named Erica Newland. In 2016, she was 29 years old, had graduated from Yale Law School. She accepts a job as an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice. And she was responsible for a nonpartisan assessment of whether particular presidential executive orders and other executive actions were lawful. Newland is a civil libertarian, believes in constraining presidential power, but she clearly took the job in 2016, assuming that she would soon be working for Hillary Clinton. Surprise, Donald Trump gets elected. She decides to stay on her job with a belief that she can play a valuable role in scrutinizing Trump's policies. But she does hear things around the office like, we're just following orders, followed by statements like, I know that's what the Nazis said, but we're not Nazis. So she increasingly found herself in an uncomfortable position. She developed a variety of justifications, but this is basically a nice person who finds herself working for a truly terrible, corrupt, harmful administration. She also believes that she and other career attorneys were being used to legitimize repugnant policies, including the Muslim ban. And then in October 2018, actually in the neighborhood where I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a white supremacist opens fire in a Pittsburgh synagogue, killing 11 people. At this point, this is too much for Newland, and she concludes that the work that she's been doing was sanctioning rhetoric that had inspired a mass killer. 3 days later, she quits her job. So there's a guy named George Packer who wrote a description of Erica Newland, and then Erica Newland herself published an editorial after Trump lost the re-election in 2020, where she apologizes to all of us for her collaboration and describes her descent to complicity. I never harbored delusions about a Trump presidency. Trump readily volunteered that his agenda was to disassemble our democracy, but I made a choice to stay at the Justice Department for as long as I could bear it. I believe that I could better serve our country by pushing back from within than from keeping my hands clean. No matter our intentions, we were complicit. We collectively perpetuated an anti-democratic leader by conforming to his assault on reality. We may have been victims of the system, but we were also its instruments. No matter how much any one of us pushed back from within, we did so as members of a professional class of government lawyers who enabled an assault on our democracy, an assault that nearly ended it. To begin with, I find Erica Newland a little bit harsh on her self-criticism. I think she was a really good person trying to do good, but I also found her argument to be an amazing demand on the rest of us to think about our own complicity and what we might need to do in order to be less complicit. And for me, the aftermath of the 2020 US election was just a tremendous story in observing complicity by Republicans who I wouldn't have liked, but I wouldn't have described as white supremacists or people who wanted to destroy democracy. But it turned out that they were willing to go with either one of those plans if they could get other things that they could like in return. And so by January, I was thinking about what do we know about people who are complicit in helping true evildoers do the evil that they choose to pursue. And so I want to tell you about my book that I'm working on. And it's going to try to fill a missing void. So if we go back sort of 20 years, over the last 20 years, and we look at the field of behavioral ethics, it's clear that the stories that we read about in the press are stories about the true evildoers: Adolf Hitler, Donald Trump, Bernie Madoff, Adam Newman, Elizabeth Holmes, Richard Sackler, Harvey Weinstein. And I would argue that social scientists largely did nothing about them because we kind of didn't know what to do. And I'm pleading guilty because I've been around the behavioral ethics field during this period of time. So since we didn't know how to stop the next evildoer from emerging, we switched from thinking about the bad apples to define a social science field that we knew something to do about, to work on. And Emily kind of described it. I wouldn't say I invented the term bounded ethicality, but I was there early on. And I think with Dolly Chugh and Mazrin Banaji was the first to define what bounded ethicality looks like. And sort of my friends and I have written a bunch of books that I would describe are all about good people who do bad things without realizing that they're doing it, the kinds of bad things that all of us on this Zoom are guilty of. And my book, Blind Spots, is a descriptive book. My book, Better Not Perfect, is an attempt to be prescriptive about what we could do better. But what I want to now do is say, maybe we left the bad apples too early. Because while I don't think I have the clinical skills to stop a true evildoer from being evil, one of the things that we see when we look at pick your favorite scandal, what we see is that there were dozens, if not hundreds of people who enabled the evil around them. I'm currently reading a book by Amos Garora called Armies of Enablers, where he focuses on the people within universities and within the Catholic Church who allowed so many young people to be raped and allowed that to continue to occur. And he argues that most of the rapes wouldn't have happened without the complicitors being involved. So I'm interested in pushing for a behavioral science that explains our profiles in complicity, and I'm going to be talking about what I think some of those profiles look like, with a notion that if we understand it, then perhaps we can figure out how to get us nice, normal people who just happen to be complicit to stop our complicity so that we can intervene on the true evildoers before they can do much of their evil. So chapters 2 through 7, many of which are drafted, are these profiles, and I'll kind of have one slide on each. So I'm going to go next slide. Don't worry if you haven't read this. I'm going to come back to this. So true partners are simply the people who are on the same side as the evildoer, who want the same outcome states. So for those of you who follow US politics, Trump had a guy named Steve Bannon, who was quite clearly a white supremacist who also was perfectly happy to destroy most of our tenets of democracy. And Trump had him centrally involved in his campaign and in the early stages of his administration. That's a true partner. The Sackler family, who owns Purdue Pharmaceuticals and mismarketed opioids to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans, and quite honestly, I don't know how many people in other lands, had the distributors and the physicians and the pharmacies who went along with the Sacklers because they were making money through the same processes of addicting people to opioids that they didn't need. But closely aligned with true partners are collaborators, people who might not want the white supremacy, but are willing to put up with it so that they can have Republicans pack the courts to get the kind of tax treatments that they prefer. A guy named Charles Duhigg wrote a very nice piece about the role of collaboration by venture capitalists, allowing Adam Newman to perpetuate his fraud at WeWork. So collaborators differ from true partners in the degree to which they overlap in goals. But obviously, when we collaborate and let the evildoer have their evil, so that we can have some other potentially harmful activity in return, we should be held quite culpable. Benefiting from privilege, I'm going to try to tell you this story quickly. Many of you know the work of Lee Ross, kind of one of the great psychologists of all time. He recently passed away, unfortunately. But I was giving a talk almost 30 years ago in the Stanford Psychology Department, and I was at the time a fairly young full professor at Northwestern University in the business school. And Lee was already a famous psychologist by then, full professor, Stanford, and he had a doctoral student who got a job in a prestigious business school, and his doctoral student was offered a salary higher than Lee's. And this reflected in the US and in some other countries, business schools paid better than psychology departments. And Lee, in the talk I was given, had the term social comparison processes in it. And Lee gave me a very gracious introduction, but he said, hopefully Max will explain why business school professors are entitled to so much more money than psychology professors. And which kind of was an awkward start. And he asked me a question about that, which I didn't give him a satisfactory answer to. And then when he closed down the session, he said, that was a very nice talk, except you never answered my question on why business school professors should get paid more. And he was clearly obsessed about this issue. And that evening, we continued on to dinner, and then the social psychology group reconvened to continue talking about social comparison processes. And finally, Lee got really angry at me. He's a very animated person. And he said, Max, what's really pissing me off isn't that you get paid more than you deserve. It's that it doesn't even bother you. You haven't even noticed the inequity in the system. And we have enough economists here that we can argue the basis for pay differences. But what was clearly true was that this bothered him a lot, and I had never even thought about this issue. And when I now read about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I read about sort of liberal whites who really don't like being accused of being privileged, particularly liberal whites who didn't grow up all that wealthy, I think back to that episode with Lee and think about the fact that it's so easy to come up with reasons to not be concerned about the ways in which privilege comes to us and to accept inequality in a variety of ways. I think another profile is when we believe in a false prophet. So Jim Jones, some of you may remember the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid. Jim Jones was a cult leader who killed 900 followers by getting them to drink a Kool-Aid-like mix to commit suicide. And basically they believed he was a prophet. In a somewhat peculiar way, I think that I think that we have corporate leaders who take on the role of guru, and people suppress thought. And in the documentations of Elizabeth Holmes and Adam Newman, we see this cult-like notion. We had in Michael's talk, we had this notion of the classic comparison to what Kahneman would call system 1 or system 2. I think that when we put faith in somebody and stop thinking about whether or not the claims are justified, we end up using faith as a system 1 process to stop our thinking. Now, this is not an anti-religious statement. There are many religions that encourage thought. But whenever we are using faith in any context as a means to say you're not entitled to think anymore, you're supposed to just trust, I think that ends up being dangerous. Now, I do have faith. I've had lots of doctoral students who I have faith in their statistical ability. I have faith in their ability to run studies better than I can. Okay, but that's based on evidence, and I'm intentionally putting faith in them. It's when we use faith as a heuristic and stop thinking that I think we have a problem. When we defer to authority or are overly loyal, we can allow people to engage in bad behavior. All of the sexual predation stories that we've read about, and I was going to say, sorry for these being American, but Dominique Strauss-Kahn was not an American story, but most of these are American stories where hundreds of people knew that sexual predation was going on and did nothing about it. And at least part of the story seems to be sort of a deference to loyalty and authority. And that's certainly true in the Catholic Church abuse story or the Penn State abuse story for you football fans out there. And finally, we can become complicit because evil is out of focus. I'm not going to tell you the Max and the DOJ story because it's too long, but rather I'm going to close with something that's close to empirical evidence and simply show you the following chart and get advice from you, since there's a bunch of economists. So you can put this in chat to not mess up the Google document. But what I want to know is which of 4 funds I should invest a significant chunk of money in. You can't have the S&P 500. That's simply up there as a benchmark. But I want to know whether to invest in tobacco, alpha, fortitude, or power. And I'll tell you that I've given this to investment professionals, MBA students, executive students, et cetera, et cetera. I often give them more time, but I don't have more time to give you. So I'll ask you to make your decision between those 4 now and commit yourself into the chat function. Go ahead and send in your answers. I'm looking for your answers. I need your answer. No one's willing to give me an answer. But anyhow, when I give this problem, the vast majority of people, typically about 75%, go with fortitude because it has high returns and low volatility. And then when I ask them, is it possible for a fund to dramatically outperform the market over a 9-year period of time without any volatility or any correlation with the market? They tell me, no, that wouldn't be possible. Which raises the question, why would you invest in fortitude if it's not possible? And in fact, fortitude, I'm missing a slide. Fortitude is Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. So if you had invested in fortitude, your investment crashed very soon after because fortitude was never possible to begin with. But my colleague Ann Tenbrunsel has this wonderful term, ethical fading. And she would argue in this context, when I ask you what to invest in, you're looking for high returns and low volatility, and ethicality, feasibility kind of fade from the description. So I'll close by saying kind of those are the profiles. I'm currently writing a chapter on the psychology of why people are complicit. And then I'm going to move on to prescriptions on what do we do about it and how do we get out of this bad behavior, and I can use plenty of help. So feel free to email me the stories. And I hope that I've now clarified to Deborah how I think that sort of imagining the parallel compliciter story where it's not your organization, it's another organization, that might get you to be less complicit in your own topic. So I'll stop here. Delighted to hear comments or questions, and I apologize if I talk too long.
Great, you are actually right in time. So then we can go on to the first question. Seems that Michal, had the first question. So Michal, go ahead.
Can't hear you, Michal. Yeah, now we can hear you.
I can figure out why I'm yellow. I just want everyone to know I do not have jaundice. It's just some sort of room I'm in or something. So what a great talk and what an important topic. So just so grateful that you're doing work in this area. I actually had a story more than it's an anecdote.
Good.
Curious what you think of it. So I had quite a few students when I was at University of Arizona. The #1 recruiter was Philip Morris. So the tobacco fund versus working for a tobacco company, which is more analogous to what you started out with, working for the Trump. I don't know which is more evil, but so I ended up with one student, and she had a lot of student loans. She had to pay for school herself, as that many of you know in the U.S. education is quite expensive. It's not a it's not a public good. And Philip Morris was the only offer she had. And she said, you know, I could hold it out. It's so evil. What should I do? And I told her, well, if you absolutely have to take the job to, and I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, if you have to take the job to pay back your loans, just take the job and do a bad job. Just marketing, right? Just make bad recommendations. And so she said, well, okay. And I go, and meanwhile, look for another job, constantly look for another job. And one thing she told me was, looking for another job, people were looking at her differently because she was working at Philip Morris. And Philip Morris, for whatever reason, didn't notice she was doing a bad job because dumb people were promoted. So she got promoted. And then finally, she got another job offered from a nonprofit making less than half, but she'd paid off her loans. And she wrote me and said, now I'm going to do penance. And so she's going to go work at a nonprofit with a lot less money. But I think it's this issue, like, you know, I'm also willing to sacrifice income to do something I consider to be more ethical. And if I were consulting for Philip Morris, I would only be willing to do it if I donated the money to charity and gave them the worst possible advice I could. Something that would be completely ineffective and fail miserably. But I do think sometimes there's that trade-off, right? Like, I mean, I couldn't tell her, well, don't work at Philip Morris, they're evil, because she had loans. And so I think sometimes there's shades of complicity. And I think you started out with a brilliant example. She didn't go in thinking, well, I'm selling my soul, but I'm going to help Donald Trump. She went in thinking, well, I'm going to try to do damage control. I guess, you know, I think there's just so much gray and complicity. You know, it's, you know, I would never vote for Donald Trump. I always support whoever's going to run against him, blah, blah, blah. But then could I have done more? Maybe. I'm not that powerful and I'm not that rich, but I could have made a bigger donation, could have knocked on doors, which I didn't do. I think it's, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the idea that complicit, non-complicit isn't really binary. There's sort of a range of fighting for justice, for, you know, there's hiding Jews in Germany during the Holocaust, which many wonderful people did, but many people didn't. But then were the people who didn't hide Jews complicit? Or were they just, there was just so much they weren't willing to sacrifice that much. And I say this as a Jew, of course, so it's something where I'm obviously emotionally affected by it. But anyway, I'm rambling, but I'm just wondering,
sure.
What do
so I'd start by saying no, it's obviously not binary. It's not even close to binary. And I don't think that the book will end up saying never be complicit. I think it makes sense to think more about one's complicity. So I'd like to think that I would not work for Philip Morris at any price. and that I don't think giving it to charity solves the problem. The Sacklers made billions of dollars by killing people by mismarketing opioids. The fact that they have their name on lots of institutions and have given away hundreds of millions of dollars doesn't solve it. Same thing with Andrew Carnegie 100 years earlier. The fact that he donated his money to libraries doesn't justify the fact that he was complicit in the murder of his employees who went on strike. So I don't think that we ever want to allow some good to get along with some bad. So in the book I published in the fall, Better Not Perfect, I in fact talk about we need to think about the portfolio of our behaviors. And so often we can do far more good by eliminating our bads than mildly increasing our goods. And so I don't want to condemn your student for taking a job when it's the only job she or he had. And that's not my job. I don't have any judicial authority to make those judgments. But I would largely think we've heard Peter Singer reference before. I certainly lean toward utilitarian views of philosophy. I would think about how do you create the most good you possibly can. But I think both your student and Erica, I'm blocking on the name of my character, but Erica in my story, it's easy to justify participating in bad, thinking that you're stopping it, when the situation may be strong enough to make that very, very hard for that to happen.
And to be fair to Erica, I think as someone who definitely cried when Donald Trump was elected and did not for a moment think he would be a good president, as horrible as I thought he would be, he far surpassed my greatest fears. Like I'm sure she went in thinking she would be more empowered to maybe make him not as bad as he seemed.
I think Erica's a terrific person.
Yeah.
But I think she would say she fooled herself by thinking that she could stop his evil rather than validating it. And that's kind of her judgment. So she's the one who calls herself complicit. I don't think that I would have ever picked her out as a candidate for me to call complicit.
Thank you for that. Super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, we have 2 more questions. I'm gonna go with Suan next because she didn't ask a question yet for anyone. So go ahead.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max. This is fabulous, really interesting. And I can't wait to buy the book and read it once it's available. So
I can't wait to write it so that you can read it. So thank you.
Great. So I thought the story of the Lee Ross story is really interesting. I was trained in psychology department and then worked briefly in a business school, got used to the salaries in business schools. And then I'm now back in the psych department, actually at Stanford. So actually totally, I accepted that until you brought this up. And Lee was like, this is a very Lee story. So, and it does make me wonder if that's fair a bit more than before, but it also makes me think about some other examples. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So too, one is that, as academics, I often complain about, okay, and I'm sure, and other people can justify why business school professors should earn that much money. Well, we're not going in there. So one example is like IT employees, workers, the industry, they are making a whole lot more money than other hardworking people in other industries. And I also took that for granted. I'm like, yeah, these businesses are making huge money, like Google and Facebook. And now I start to wonder, okay, is that fair or is that also complicity? So that's one example. It's like people in certain industry, because of the industry is doing well, whether it's like fair or not, like whether they should be harvesting this much money. It's like, is that another example? So that's one. And another one is like, now I think about Americans compared to, if you look into the kind of the developmental economists, like all these ways that US profit of other countries. And now, like, living in the US, are we being complicit? And then that just leads down this thought pattern, like, what can we do now that I do feel that maybe we like living in the US, like maybe we should do something, but then what is that? And then like, how can you, and then probably for many people, they would stop thinking about this, like just accept, okay, this is reality. But if you want people to take some action after reading the book, like what is the way to go there? That's my thought.
Yeah, so there were a lot of comments and questions there. So let me start by saying I would have no problem participating in a debate where I took the side that markets are good and therefore it's okay for me to make more money as a business school professor. I don't think that position is that hard to defend. I think that the psychologically interesting aspect is how not only Lee and I could have differences, but that inequality isn't even on the minds of the privileged. Okay, that the justification eliminates it from even being something to consider. And by the way, Lee and I and Christina Diekman, D-I-E-K-M-A-N-N, and Steve Samuels, we wrote a paper, a JPSB paper, where we looked specifically at this topic and looked at the psychology of how this sort of accepting one's own privilege emerges. So. And so I don't mean to condemn the behavior, but I think we could be more aware of our own complicity. And when our own complicity is truly creating harm, I think we could be more thoughtful about it rather than justifying that harm. So I kind of quite like the Deborah. This is a Deborah Schulman extension. By the way, I don't know Deborah. But sort of the notion of before you act in a potentially complicit way, can you reframe it and imagine a story where you're reading about someone else in some other industry where they engaged in this behavior? Would you hold them complicit? And if you would hold them to be complicit, does that tell you something about what your own behavior should potentially be? But we not only have our own behavior to think about, but we train people who are going to be leaders, and leaders could provide, could change the norms, the values, the reward systems in our organizations so that complicit behavior is less valued or even punished. This guy, Amos Gora, in books called Armies of Enablers, he's a lawyer, and one of his agenda items is to make complicitors criminally liable for harm. He's thinking about the sexual assault story, but he basically sees a variety of people in university hierarchies and within religious institutions who knew and perpetuated without actually conducting the rapes to be criminally liable. And he's working on passing laws to do exactly that. So I think we can not only think about our own behavior, but the environments that we help create within our universities, our organizations, within our society that can have a significant effect on the behavior of wrongdoers. And I think I've only touched on like 40% of your question, which was really interesting. So, but I think I may be out of time. So I'll turn it back to Emily to see what happens next.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.